Now, how many people died? UN expert evaluating the population of Rwanda estimated that 800,000 Rwandans had died between April and July. Seltzer, he's the expert, estimated the number of persons killed as at least 500,000. Professor Gerald estimated that 130,000 Tutsi were alive in July. But there's another 20,000, perhaps, in Zaire or Tanzania. We're not really sure. If this number of 150,000 is subtracted from an estimated population of 657,000 Tutsi, this leaves 507,000 Tutsi killed, close to Seltzer's minimum assessment. This comes from Human Rights Watch, the organization that Allan Stam was very closely associated with. So, we tried to replicate Mr. Seltzer's study. My name is Christian Davenport. We're writing to Professor Seltzer. I've been studying this stuff for about 10 years. I was curious how you generated your estimation of 500,000 killed during the violence of '94. Is there a paper? Can you tell us how you did it? I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Dear Christian, thank you for your question and your interest. In answer to your first question, the key feature of my estimate of more than 500,000 deaths was not the specific figure of 500,000, but the words more than. The figure, more than 500,000, was modeled on the notion that an estimate of about, or at least 6 million died in the Holocaust was sufficient for the Nuremberg prosecution. I can no longer recall why I settled on 500,000 as the lower anchor of my estimate. I do remain interested in the subject, however. Thanks for your interest. Regards, Bill. William Seltzer. This is the UN expert. This is the estimate that everything is based on. Samantha Power, Wikipedia, Gurevich, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, everywhere. They made it up. Why? Because they were outraged. Allan Stam and Bill Seltzer were outraged that there wasn't going to be a tribunal like Nuremberg. They wanted the perpetrators to be held accountable. They wanted them rounded up and put in jail. And they felt, what did it take to get Nuremberg? Well, it took a big number to get Nuremberg. So, we need a number. We need a big number. We need a compelling number. And so, they came up with one. Now, the question is whether it's a plausible number or not. So, we have data. A lot of it. Most of it is really bad. And I'm going to explain in a minute why. So, we have some data that's only large-scale killings. We have some data that covers the whole country, some not. Physicians for Human Rights, these are some really crazy guys. They actually exhumed a mass grave, and they counted up the numbers of bodies in the grave. They identified, they were able to separate them by age, sex. But the key was, based on thigh bones, they could come up with an accurate number of people that were in that mass grave. Okay? Now, the reason why that matters is the Ministry of Youth, Culture, and Sport, it is an odd name, I have to say. It's sort of European, actually. In America, we would not call the Ministry of Youth, Culture, and Sport the group responsible for doing the mass grave identification project. But in this case, that's who does it. So what we did was, these guys, the Ministry of Youth, Culture, and Sport, cataloged all of the mass graves in the country. It's about 130 of them. Christian and I visited 85 of those to make sure that the list was accurate. Every single place that was on the list that we went to exists. The number of bodies that are in those mass graves, we only have one that's been exhumed, but the exhumation numbers are pretty darn close to what's on the Mass Graves Identification Project's claim of what should have been in there. Now, Human Rights Watch, they interviewed people. They did, Allan Stam, her collaborators and colleagues there, went around and interviewed people, refugees at the borders of Burundi and Tanzania, to get estimates of how many people had died. We also have the Ministry of Education did a countrywide survey going house to house, asking people about what took place in large-scale massacres. The Ministry of Local Affairs, Minaloc, did a household census a few years afterwards and cataloged individual deaths. Ibuka is the Tutsi survivor organization, the indigenous group. They did an exhaustive effort in collaboration with the Ministry of Local Affairs and a fellow named Philip Verwimp, who's a professor, was a professor at Leuven University, to catalog what took place in one of the 13 provinces. They did an exhaustive study there. Africa Rights, Aegis Trust, and ICTR witness testimony. We used all of these pieces of information to come up with essentially a weighted average. We took the witness testimony. As I said, we had some 12,000 witness statements. We wrote software to go through and look for keywords. We then had, once we had keywords based on rape, killing, or assault, we then assigned undergraduate research assistants to go through and document what took place at what date at what location. And we use these as our start dates that I'll show you in a few minutes. And what we do is we take all this information, and our applied statistician tells us what we're doing is just the right thing. We have a very sophisticated weighted average. And what we do is we weight it by some pieces of information we have great confidence in. Other pieces of information we have less confidence in. And so then what we can do is we can come up with a range of estimates of how many people died, subject to assumptions. If we assume the Rwandan government's surveys are reasonably good, we can tell you what that number would be. If you believe human rights organizations' estimates, based on other methodologies, we can tell you what that number would be. Okay? I don't think we're ever going to actually know specifically what happened. But I do think that the Rwandan government, for a variety of politically good reasons, made a good faith effort to document what happened, both at the individual household census level and at the mass graves level. And they came up with some pretty darn big numbers. Now, let's come up with some victim counts here. We'll start off with a set of assumptions. We start off with a population driven by the 1991 census. We have a population of about 7.6 million. Tutsi population in 1991 is about 650,000. Now, the question is, how many Tutsi survive? Human Rights Watch estimated 150,000. That's from Gerald Prunier's estimate of 130,000. We've contacted Mr. Prunier several times. It's an estimate. It's a back of the envelope. I sat down, I thought about it. I'd seen a lot of things happen. I talked to a lot of people. It's an estimate. Ibuka has an estimate based on a 1998 count, household count, that there were 283,000 Tutsi survivors living in the country in 1998. AIDS and a variety of other pathologies are endemic in this part of the world. So we say, if we take the survivor organization's estimate, we think that probably 300,000 Tutsi survived. Now, that gives us the Human Rights Watch estimate of 500,000, conveniently. At least their math works out, roughly. That's a good thing to see. Or, if we use the survivors organization estimate of how many people survived, and there's a reason they would bias it upwards, the fewer indigenous Tutsi there are that survived, the less claim to political control they have. So they have, everybody here has a reason to fudge the truth. But if we use the Tutsi victim story, we end up with 345,000 Tutsi dead. That's a lot. And a significant proportion of those people that are dead out of that number died because their name was on a list. They were deliberately targeted because they were Tutsis of a particular ilk. So where does this leave us? Well, we have a bunch of different data sources that cover the whole country. The Mass Graves Project identifies 800,000 victims. If we subtract the Tutsi victims, that gives us 490,000 Hutu dead. If we take the government census from the year 2000, we have about 900,000 victims, 570,000 Hutu dead. If we use the Human Rights Watch estimates, we end up with a slightly smaller figure. Ministry of Local Affairs estimates 1.3 million dead. We come up with an estimate of about 900,000 Hutu that are dead. Our Bayes weighted statistical estimate, if we privilege some of the government information, we end up with an estimate of roughly 1 million people that are dead. 700,000 Hutu victims.